Thank you, Steve, very much. I actually wasn't quite old enough to have had a seminal impact in the late 50s. And in the sort of wonderful way that synchronicity happens, I actually had nothing to do with the gift that my father made. I was not involved in those conversations. And in some regards, that makes it more sweet, because instead of feeling that I needed to be an actor to facilitate it, it happened because all of the parties saw it, as Steve so eloquently put it, as something that was meant to be, with many points of intersection and many connections. Steve, in terms of points of connection, was telling me last night that this is the last semester that he's going to be teaching at Brandeis, and he started teaching when I was a student. So I think that's a very nice arc, and I want to thank you for all that you have done, because your fingerprints are all over this, and it would not have been possible without you. And I also want to thank Kitty, who I've known over the years and who makes it a particular pleasure to be able to be a part of this, to share this together. We share the experience of having iconic fathers. But beyond that, we're going to talk over the next 2 days about the legacy of Lenny Bruce. Kitty is the legacy of Lenny Bruce. And it was Kitty's vision and passion and fierce protectiveness that preserved all those papers and all those extraordinary recordings, and then had the generosity of spirit to make it available not just to her family, but to all of us, and we owe her a deep, deep debt. So thank you. I lastly want to thank YouTube, with whom we've partnered, which is going to allow many more people than those in this room to listen in on the next 2 days and to participate. And even as you heard today in meeting Steve from Paris, Lenny himself, his life, his work, his struggles, and the issues raised by all of those are contemporary and global, and the more we can amplify the audience engaged in that conversation, the better. So these days, we talk a lot about being in an age of disruption, Airbnb and hotels, Netflix and Blockbuster, Uber and taxis, Amazon and retailers. And it's true that much of what consumers and businesses knew even 15 years ago has dramatically changed. But while the technologies and globalization have accelerated change in our times, we actually think about the fact that being disruptive and provocative is not unique to our times, and was very much a defining element of the late 50s and the early 60s. It's been said the times they were a-changing, and perhaps what's most striking about those times when we compare them to today is that the changes were less about business models and actually more about ideas and values, about conformity and hypocrisy. And the challengers were less often entrepreneurs and more often activists and artists. It's easy to lose sight of what America looked like in post-World War II era. The man in the gray flannel suit, the happy housewife, the traditional family that was started in the early 20s, the Eisenhower years, an age of conformity. But underneath that placid surface, a lot of pent-up demand for change was roiling. The feminine mystique, the civil rights movement, the Beat generation, a growing questioning of government, a questioning of traditional attitudes about sex and reproduction. Through the impact of the GI Bill, by 1960, the United States became the first society to have more college students than farmers. The country was poised for a generational prison break. And these non-traditional ideas were being expressed in all media, in art, in poetry, in music, in film, in books and magazines. There was a space opening up in the culture, more oxygen in the air. It was a distinct moment for the transgressive, the avant-garde versus the old guard. Born Leonard Alfred Schneider in 1925, Lenny Bruce died 50 years ago at the age of 40. But in his short life, he became a superstar. And in the years since then, his fame and influence have only grown. Comedy Central ranked him the third greatest comedian of all time, following Richard Pryor and George Carlin, two clear successors to Lenny's groundbreaking work. As Steve alluded to, previous generations of comedians, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, Milton Berle, had a style of telling rapid-fire jokes, a brief setup followed by a punchline. And Lenny's style couldn't have been more different. He wrote his own material, rooted in personal experiences, targeting the hypocrisy of contemporary society. Along with the others of his time, like Mort Saul and Dick Gregory and Elaine May and Mike Nichols, he was more a comic thinker than a comedian. And as Steve mentioned, all of those people had some connection to Playboy, featured in the magazine or performing in the Playboy clubs or on Playboy's Penthouse, the syndicated television show my father hosted. A show, as an aside, that got no carriage in the South because its format was to feature black performers in front of an integrated audience on the set. There were many points of intersection between Lenny and my father, which really led up to the logic of the Hugh M. Hefner Foundation making the grant that facilitated this acquisition. Playboy was launched in December of 1953, and my father envisioned it as a guidebook for the urban male that would combine lifestyle information with entertainment and thoughtful and provocative great writing, both fiction and nonfiction. It was underpinned, though, by a philosophy that centered around the critical importance of personal freedom and individual rights. And as a result of that, Hef and the magazine were especially interested in the other rebels of that time. They published, for example, Jack Kerouac and Fahrenheit 451. They assigned Alex Haley to conduct the very first Playboy interview, which was with Miles Davis, who spent a good deal more time talking about race than music. They broke with the Norman Rockwell tradition of straightforward illustration to feature the work of great artists like Roger Brown and Andy Warhol. They launched an annual jazz poll and organized a Playboy Jazz Festival in Chicago in 1959 to benefit the Urban League. Hef first met Lenny in 1958 when he went to San Francisco to hear him perform. This was shortly after Lenny was really breaking through with new material and a new style of delivery that was allowing him to play in nightclubs that were not also strip clubs. Hef was so impressed that he contacted friends who owned the Gate of Horn Club in Chicago and arranged for Lenny to play there. The Illinois obscenity statute had recently been amended to reflect the 1957 Supreme Court Roth decision. So many people were feeling that nightclubs, were really free speech zones. Lenny went on to play Mr. Kelly's in Chicago, and that led to his being interviewed by Studs Terkel. The next year, the magazine profiled him in an article entitled "Rebel with a Caustic Cause." In the early 60s, he appeared on Playboy's Penthouse, and then the magazine first excerpted, and then the company published his autobiography, How to Talk Dirty and Influence People. Many times he stayed at the Chicago Playboy Mansion when he was in town. I would say, like contemporary art and contemporary jazz, Hef dug Lenny. But Lenny was more than a gifted, disruptive artist experimenting with extremes like a Jackson Pollock or a Miles Davis. Lenny became a martyr. Hef also knew what it was like to be persecuted. The magazine was denied its second-class postal permit and had to go to court to win it. That 1959 jazz festival I told you about was supposed to be at Soldier Field, but the Catholic Church pressured the first Mayor Daley to pull the permit. In later years, Hef would be on Nixon's enemies list, a source of great pride. And the company would go to court to challenge Reagan's Meese Commission, which was pressuring retailers not to sell the magazine, Congress for defunding the Braille, yes, the Braille edition of Playboy, and a bill that was attempting to limit all of cable to the broadcast network standards, which resulted in a Supreme Court victory codifying that cable standards would be the same as print and online. In another small world connection, that case was argued by Bob Corn Revere. Bob would go on to successfully petition the state of New York for Lenny's pardon in 2003, and that inspired Ron Collins's book, The Trials of Lenny Bruce. That book would win a Hugh M. Hefner First Amendment Award. But in Playboy's battles, Hef not only had great lawyers, including some like Harry Calvin, who also represented Lenny on a pro bono basis. In Hef's battles, he had a large company behind him and a powerful platform in the magazine. Lenny had none of that, just friends. And Hef was one of those friends. A friend who believed in Lenny and who stood with him in the good times, the bad times, the unpopular times, and all times. Because alone among the many rebellious artists, talented men and women who were his contemporaries, Lenny Bruce was persecuted and prosecuted for his words and his ideas. Because he confronted the hypocrisy of institutions and of society, because he was willing to criticize and challenge stereotypes, he became a target. Fundamentally, he was busted over and over and over again for blasphemy. But because blasphemy is not against the law, he was prosecuted for obscenity. Lenny Bruce was very much an artist of his times. Time magazine called him the Elvis of comedy. It was often noted that his monologues were delivered in the rhythms of a jazz musician, most famously perhaps his to is a preposition, come is a verb. But at the same time, I believe that his relevance and resonance today couldn't be greater. While it is a tragedy for Lenny and his family that he died so young, in some ways his best years came after his death, because he has left us with a critically important legacy that will begin to be explored over the next 2 days by 24 distinguished scholars and thinkers. For my part, I would observe the following. We live in a time when Lenny's comic bloodlines have flourished like never before. Much of the comedy we hear today was pioneered by Lenny. Comedy that similarly challenges and channels the contemporary zeitgeist. That includes not only great male comics like Louis Black, who we'll hear tonight, but incredible female comics like Sarah Silverman and Amy Schumer. Today, comedians, as a matter of course, employ their personal lives and voices to comment on society, its mores, its values. When we listen to Stephen Colbert or John Oliver or Jon Stewart, we're going to them not just for comedy, but for critical perspective. Just like listening to Lenny made us both laugh and think, and sometimes it also made us squirm. Because a part of Lenny's genius was how he related to an audience, how he created for them and with them the experience of being overcome with laughter over that which was both hilarious and transgressive. In a time of the Charlie Hebdo murders, we would do well to be thoughtful about the role of humor in human affairs, and to think about what are perhaps unacknowledged, the off-limits of today. As Marty Garbus has said, and we are very fortunate to be hearing from him later today, quote, "The history of the law of free expression is one of vindication in cases involving speech that many citizens find shabby, offensive, or even ugly," end quote. After all, we don't need a First Amendment to protect popular speech. The First Amendment is unique to America, and in theory, widely admired. But so much of our discourse about freedom of speech is abstract, starting with the fact that it's important to understand that free speech and the First Amendment are not the same thing. The First Amendment is necessary, but not sufficient. Almost everyone attempting to limit free expression starts by saying, "I'm not for censorship, but..." As Hugo Black noted, we must not be afraid to be free. We should be asking ourselves, what is transgressive at this moment, and how do we not just protect, but nurture it? We come together on the campus of a great university, founded in the name of a brilliant jurist, who established the standard for the only kind of speech that I believe should be banned. that which is intended and likely to cause immediate violence. Let's be careful that our more developed sensitivities around inclusion and diversity don't turn into ways to protect people, and especially students, from challenging ideas. As Robert Zimmer, president of the University of Chicago, has said, quote, "Universities cannot be viewed as a sanctuary for comfort, but rather as a crucible for confronting ideas and thereby learning to make informed judgments in complex environments." In the 60s, students were demanding the right to free speech. Now, at least some students demand the right to be free from speech that they find to be offensive, upsetting, or emotionally disturbing. And while private universities, like private companies such as Facebook and Twitter, are not bound by the First Amendment, I share the belief of Jeffrey Rosen, legal scholar and head of the National Constitution Center, that they would do well to resist pressure to moderate speech or content in the name of promoting civility. As Salman Rushdie, someone who certainly knows firsthand what it means to offend, has said, quote, "What is freedom of expression? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist." This conference is extremely timely, as during this election season, much has been noted about the need for greater civility in our politics and in the media. I concur. I too worry that whereas a different race or religion used to be the greatest concern of parents regarding who their child would marry, now it's political affiliation. And whereas back in the 60s, everybody watched the same TV shows and read the same magazines, now it's so easy to be balkanized and choose to only be exposed to those ideas and points of view that we agree with and that agree with us. Yet even as we work towards a more civil union, let's be sure that we remain equally committed to that transgressive idea and ideal that underpinned Lenny's work, that nothing is sacrosanct. Everything is open to being questioned and challenged and even mocked, because that is also what underpins our democracy. When Lenny was pardoned back in 2003, it was said, in fact, that pardon was for the rest of us. Let's be sure we earned it. Thank you.
We have time for questions. If anybody has any, Ms. Hefner. Just an anecdote rather than a question you might find.
Great.
Sorry, could you just use the mic?
If you wait, because then it'll get recorded.
The Library of Congress keeps Playboy magazine in the rare book room, which is a very strange place. If you've ever done any research there, it's got very thick carpets and very polished tables and all. Some years ago, when I was doing some research on stand-up comedy, I had opportunity to go down there and look at, because Playboy published an interview with Mort Saul, Lenny Bruce, Jules Pfeiffer, and I forget who, and Jonathan Winters, and I wanted to use that material. So I went up to the Library of Congress Rare Book Room, and the librarian very aggressively said, "What do you want that for?" And I said, "I don't have to tell you that." I said, "I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, and even if I weren't, as a U.S. citizen, I have access to this." So she brings the volume, and then she goes, a lot of dusting to kind of watch what I was doing. And so I waited until she got within eye shot, and I turned around to the centerfold and I started taking notes. So she's probably still reeling from that.
Thank you.
This isn't really a question, but I just want to say that this is really a good thing. This is happening. You know, I was thinking the other day, at the end of his life, I mean, the day he died, the Bank of America foreclosed on his house. He hadn't worked in a long time, and he could get an occasional concert, and that was it, you know. And, I'm told, or I've read, that he was afraid at the end that no one would remember. And I think it's wonderful that 50 years after his death, at a Northeastern Ivy League school, which is about as far from Lenny Bruce's Hollywood as it's possible to get in the continental United States. Here we are gathering to discuss a scholarly discussion on his life, on his career, and a celebration of his life. I tend not to refer to Lenny Bruce as a comedian. I call him a humorist, because in my opinion, he's right up there with Mark Twain, Robert Benchley, Will Rogers, the best of them, you know. And I think he's the most important humorist of the 20th century. And thank you again. Oh, my name's Tom Deacon. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Can you please elaborate a little bit on what you see are the dangers in free speech on the campuses, whether it's limits of too much political correctness and things like that? So I just want you to elaborate on that a little bit, please.
Sure. I quoted President Zimmer. I live in Chicago. And I think all universities are grappling with this. And where's Greg? So stand up, Greg. So Greg is the founder and head of an organization called FIRE. And we've worked together through the foundation and around First Amendment. And you should make a point of finding Greg after this session when we're on coffee break, because we used to support and still do the Student Press Law Center, which is a really wonderful organization that has worked on behalf of the rights of students in whether they're working on their school newspaper or they're organizing on campus, because many of us feel that there's a double harm when you censor, student speech or student journalists. The first is the censorship itself, but the second is the message that you're sending to people who are in a learning environment, which is so contrary to the message you want to send them. FIRE now is aggressively also working in that space, and Greg can tell you a lot about individual cases. But I mentioned President Zimmer because a friend of mine, Jeff Stone, who's a distinguished constitutional lawyer and actually wrote a book called Free Speech in Perilous Times that won a Hugh Hefner Award a few years ago, was tasked by the university to write a kind of a mission statement that would express the university's view that it would not and could not and should not trade off its commitment to freedom of expression for comfort for students, while at the same time being respectful of different voices. And that kind of mission statement, if you will, or code is being adopted by a number of other schools. And I think they're striking the right balance. But I think that we have all seen examples in the press of the heckler's veto, of disinvitations to controversial speakers. And as I tried to reference in my own remarks, I am, like everybody else, gratified by the continuing advancement in our society of respect for diversity and inclusion and tolerance that wasn't always there. So holding on to those values is important, but where they actually run up against the right of free expression is, I think, the moment where we have to say the best antidote to speech that we not only don't agree with, but we find distasteful or even hateful is more speech.
I want to raise the Jewish question. Lenny Bruce allowed me and many of my contemporaries in the 1950s and 60s to re-identify with the Jewish experience. And my first article ever published was Lenny Bruce, a Jewish humorist in Babylon. Right now I'm working on a film inspired by your father. It's called Taking Sides. It's a film about Lenny Bruce, Mort Saul, and Dick Gregory. And I'm wondering why the foundation hasn't considered a similar kind of film, because our young people today, given the polluted political atmosphere that has come into the discourse, I think we need to reawaken consciousness of Lenny Bruce, Mort Sahl, and Dick Gregory.
Yeah. Well, the foundation isn't a filmmaker, but they have given grants to films, wonderful films from The Celluloid Closet, which sort of trace the history of representation of homosexuality in film, to, The Atomic Cafe. So all I would say in answer to the direct question is, if you are working on a film, you should make an application for support from the foundation, and you're quite right that all three of those people had a very deep connection to Playboy, and in fact, Dick Gregory, who's kind of a casual friend, is unbelievably generous and outspoken about how he would not have had a career but for Playboy, because for a black comic to be able to play in front of an integrated audience, either in a club or on television, was really unheard of in the time that he was coming of age, and he would say that Playboy gave him the chance. So those issues of race and personal freedom and free expression were also, I think, integrally related. Well, I'm going to turn the podium back over to Steve. I'm going to be here all day and all evening, and it'd be my pleasure to visit with any and all of you during that time. So thank you again.